So in the last lesson, we learned how to consume our context API, but how do we dynamically set values in the new context that we've created? Well, I'm going to show you how we can do that, but we got to first make a new context to replace our current user reducer that stores the value of our user that we pull in from our Firestore. So instead of using the setCurrentUser dispatched action and then our current user reducer, we are going to use the new context API to create a current user context. So just like last time, we are going to make a new context folder called current user, because what it stores is the context of our current user. So we'll make a current user.context.js. If you remember, we import in create context from React. And then we just set this const current user context equal to create context. And then we'll have a default value of undefined, because there's no initial value for our user. So we're just going to set it to undefined. And then we're going to export this out. So we set it undefined in the same way that we might have set it to null or undefined inside of our reducer whenever we set an initial value that we knew that value would probably be an object, because we know our current user is an object of some kind. So now, in order for us to actually set this value, we need to figure out where inside of our component we're going to get access to it. And access to that will, of course, be in the app.js, because this is where we perform the actual fetch itself. Now, one caveat that I must mention about setting this value is that just like we saw in our previous lesson, in our collection component, before we used the use context hook, we had to leverage our collection context.consumer component in order to consume it. We actually have to now use that other one that I was telling you about, the provider component. And unlike use context, the hook, we don't have access to a hook that allows us to make that easier, which means that we actually have to code in a specific way when we want to pass that value around and update the context value. So let me show you what we're going to do. First, I'm going to import in our new current user context. So here I'm just going to import in that current user context from context/current user/current user context. Now, the place that we are going to set this value is also the place where we're probably going to leverage it. So we can really put this anywhere, really. But if you remember, our app represents the highest level of our component tree. So we got to think about where it is inside of this tree that needs access to this value. Now, the reason why we do this is because you remember that I mentioned that this provider is going to be an actual component. Well, this injects the context into the tree at that level. Meaning that, let's say, for example, we know that the only other place where we use our current user is in our header component. If it's inside of our header component, that means that we need to wrap this new provider around that header component at the very least, because our header is going to consume this current user context inside of it. If we wrap this somewhere else, like let's say we put this current user context around this route instead, we actually would not be able to access the dynamically changed values of our context from this header. If we, say, inside of our header, used a context.consumer somewhere inside of here, .consumer. If we had this somewhere here, we wouldn't actually be able to access the dynamic value. We would only ever be able to access the initial value. The reason for this is because the way that the context API works is it goes up the tree right, from where it currently is, the actual consumer itself, so inside of the header component, right, wherever we wrapped it, it will go up the tree of components until it finds the same context, so in our case, the current user context, and it'll look for a provider. If there is no provider that has supplied a new value, then it will just use the initial state that we instantiated our current user context with. So that's one very important thing to keep in mind about Context API. So because we know that our header is probably going to be the only place that uses the current user, we are just going to wrap this header component. Let's say we did this, but not consumer. It is actually provider. Here, what we're going to do is we are going to now make sure to set the value. And the way we do it is we'll leverage our render. So how we're going to do that is we need to now switch over to leveraging our component state, because our component state is going to be the way that we store this current user object. So we're going to make a constructor, call our super, and set this.state equals our current user, which starts off as null. Now, what we're going to say is that whenever this component did mount instantiates, right, and then we subscribe to our auth on auth state changed, whenever we actually get the snapshot of the object we want to store as our current user, instead of calling setCurrentUser like we did before, we are now just going to call this.setState, and we're going to set state where our current user object is equal to this object. We're also going to make sure that this.setState, when our user logs out, so as you remember, when a user logs out, we get null, right? We also want to set the current user equal to that null value as well. So we've pretty much just replaced our reducer that was storing our setCurrentUser over to using local state. Now, the reason we do this is because this value that changes here is what we're going to pass into our context. So here we're going to say value using the value key as this.state.currentUser. And now, whenever this state of current user changes, it will pass that value into the provider. And any consumer that is consuming this value will re-render whenever this value changes, because that's the nature of how Context API updates our React application. So by doing this, we now are leveraging our local state again. And we actually have to do this because in order for us to actually make sure that we're keeping track of whatever is happening inside of this component, of course, we got to do it inside of the component as well. So that's just the one caveat. This is actually one of the issues some people have with Context API, is that you have to re-leverage component state in order to pass that value around inside of your application. This is just because the actual paradigm of the Context API is a little different from the paradigm of our Redux that we're used to using. Context API is kind of just an easier way for you to pass around the value of this thing that you want to store into components that are nested deeply. Because our app component is still a component that will be the one that mounts first, right, is at the highest level. So it holds access to actual user information, right? So just like before when we had to think about where do we want to make sure that we put the code that fetches the data, we have to think about that again. Because this is going to be the place where we actually put the provider that will wrap the rest of the component tree that needs access to that value that we want to pass around. Because as you remember, the problem we're trying to solve is prop drilling. We're solving prop drilling here. So for that reason, this is just how we have to do it. we have to leverage the component state of the component at the level that has access to the actual value that we want to dynamically update our context with. Now, we also need to switch this.props over to leveraging this.state because, of course, we're not getting it from state anymore, right? So now we've pretty much switched over this component to leveraging our context. So let's get rid of course, what we had before, which was our Redux bindings. So let's just remove this connect. So now we're storing our current user locally, but we actually need to consume it from our header component. So the place that consumes it inside of our header component is this section of the code right here, right, where we store this current user. Well, now it's actually really easy because all we need to do is bring in our use context hook, and we'll bring in that current user context that we just made. Current user context from context, current user context. And now we just got to make sure that we use that new hook, right? So we convert our default return from this function over instead to a explicit return because we need to pull off the current user from our current user context. Current user context. We're no longer pulling this in, right, from a selector. So now current user is being passed in like this, and that's it. If we save now, let's actually also get rid of this map state to props. Actually, we still might leverage the hidden. So you know what? Let's just get rid of this for now, right? Because we're not using the select current user selector anymore, right? We're using our context. We're setting current user. Code still looks the exact same. If we look now, we see that we have access to our signed in user, right? If I click sign out, as we see, everything still works. We sign back in. Our auth is still triggering. Inside of our app.js, we're storing the user, right, on the local state, passing it into our provider. And then our provider updates on the actual context. And then the context will propagate that current user change into any places that's consuming the context. So I know it's a lot of words for something that actually seems pretty simple. But the only reason for that is just because there are these caveats around using it that I just want to highlight because there are certain issues that will arise if you don't think about it. So the main thing is just how you're going to structure the hierarchy of your application in terms of where you're going to put your providers and where you're going to put your consumers. So with that, that's it. We are now leveraging our current user inside of this header context.